Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the GAA Lean Body Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Keane, strength and conditioning coach and sports nutritionist, here to help you with all things GAA related fitness. Today's episode, we are going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about some must-read books for GAA players. Now, I know, similar to me, a lot of you may not be natural readers, something that I started to do in my mid-20s, around the age of 24, 25. I started to read a lot more books, mostly in the form of audiobooks. I'm a huge audiobook fan. I'll actually link, I've got a code with Audible for anyone that wants it. It'll give you your first book on Audible for free. So any of the books that I talk about in today's podcast or any of my books, you can get on there for free, your first book. So I'll actually link that in the description as well. But at the age of 24, 25, I started to read a lot more books. I understood that you can considerably shorten your learning curve and you can learn most things out there yourself. And then obviously you have to execute and apply it to your context and situation. But most of the answers that you need with your mindset for sports performance, with your nutrition, with your sleep, with your recovery, it's all written down out there, or it's been consumed, or it's been created in some form for you to consume. And with books, what I love about them is you tend to get people's best messages in one place. One of the best things about a podcast is it can go in any direction. When you're chatting or doing a solo episode like this, or if I'm chatting to a guest on this show or other shows, my Brian Keane podcast, etc., you can kind of go in different directions to what a book would cover. But when you're reading a book, somebody has gone on that, and I've written 4 books, 3 bestsellers, and in every one of the processes, I'd say I've read it 100 times, 150 times, 200 times, because you're going back over, you're refining it, you're taking out things that may not necessarily serve the book, you're making sure that it's only the vital parts that's in there, and you're trying to remove the fluff. And as a result of that, you tend to get people's best work. And in today's podcast, I'm going to talk about 5 must-read books. Now, when I say must-read, it's a very kind of catchy clickbait title, because the truth is I originally had this title as 5 useful books for GAA players, but must read books probably sounds better in the title. And the truth is, these, if it's something you struggle with, I wouldn't necessarily recommend all 5 of these in order. And I have an honourable mention as well, a 6th book. But if it's something you struggle with, I'm going to talk about what I got from the books, why they were useful, and if you should use your time to potentially consume it. And as I said, if you're listening to this podcast, I highly recommend audiobooks. If you're already into audio learning, which straight away, the fact that you're listening to this tells me that you are, audiobooks are a great hack for somebody who either struggles with reading or struggles with sitting down to prioritize the time, or in my case, got better with this as I got older, but definitely into my mid-20s, I just struggled to concentrate on the words. But audio, I was taking it in as in a different form because I was an audio learner, and there's a good chance if you're listening to a podcast like this, you're probably similar. So I would highly recommend that if you don't already. So without further ado, let's jump in no particular order, because these books are quite different outside of the realm of GAA. So let's jump in. So the first book is a recent one that I read, and one that I really enjoyed, and it's called Peak: The New Science of Athletic Performance That is Revolutionizing Sports, and it's by Dr. Marc Bubbs. And there's a few parts of this book that I really enjoyed. Now, the downside of it is, and I'll start with the cons, is it's a book that tries to be a lot of things to a lot of different sports, meaning that it talks about basketball, football, soccer, which is all great if you're a GAA player, because there's a lot of crossover there when it comes to the skill set, the recovery, the nutrition, etc. But it also talks about ultra endurance, and it talks about marathon running, and it talks about different sports that go across a spectrum from short sprint-based glycotic, GAA, not GAA as an example, but Aussie rules football is in there, tennis, etc., all the way to 100-mile ultramarathons and triathlon. So the downside of this book, as long as you go in with that expectation that it tries to be a little bit too many things to too many people, there's some really good new science and cutting edge science in here when it comes to your training, how you approach training, how you approach nutrition, how you approach your recovery, how you approach your sleep. And one of the main takeaways that I got from it, and it's one of these books that I ended up picking up and making a few sample notes as I went along, particularly in the recovery side. One big thing that I got, and this was anecdotally how I felt, but never actually had any research to support it, so I followed up on the research off the back of listening to this, and that was on ice baths versus cryotherapy chambers. And I've gone and done both, where I've gone into a chamber, a cryotherapy chamber, which drops your temperature really low, and I've done cryotherapy baths. And I never felt the recovery aspect from the cryotherapy chamber. When you go into a chamber where you're actually not getting wet, it's cold steam. And I remember reading about athletes using cryo chambers and it being really popular in the NFL and in the Premier League and in rugby union. And I thought, well, I've given this 6 or 7 attempts and I'm actually not feeling any benefit. Whereas if I jump into a cryo bath or an ice bath, I feel that benefit nearly instantly as soon as I come out of it for the next 24 to 48 hours. And in this book, it's linked to the studies around cryo chambers and the repair using the biomarkers in inflammation and inflammatory repair from cryo chambers versus cryo baths. And it made me think, okay, I need to double down on that. I'm not actually going to spend my money anymore on cryo chambers. The research now is caught up, and the reason it's so popular is it's easier, and the argument in the book is that it's easier to convince an athlete to go into a cryo chamber where you don't get wet, it's not super uncomfortable, than to go into an ice bath or a cryo bath, because it's really hard, it's really uncomfortable, but all the benefits are in that. The other thing that I didn't realize, and this is something that I'm currently doing more research into, is that ice baths, although for years sports scientists, myself included, thought that it reduced inflammation, and that was the reason that it worked so well for recovery between sessions. But apparently now they're looking into the new science that it's an analgesic, the fact that it's reducing your sensory your pain receptors, meaning that you don't feel as much pain, and as a result you're able to train harder the next day. So you don't really need to know the reasons for that. It's unimportant because the result is the same, meaning that whether it's reduced inflammation or an analgesic effect where you feel less sore the next day, you're still able to go out and perform better on the pitch, do your gym session, recover potentially from injury faster, and all of the benefits that come with ice. So personally, although when I read it, there was nothing new in the book that I got, that was something that I followed up on off the back of it. And that's all you can really ask from a book is, does it give you everything you need? There's another book in a similar space that I read shortly after it. It was Peak Performance, Elevate Your Game, Avoid Burnout, and Thrive with the New Science of Success. And that is a very useful book if you've never read any other books on mental and physical performance. But if you have, I don't necessarily recommend it. There's nothing new in it. It's just a rehash of other books. But if this is your first introductory point into a mindset approach for peak performance and a physical approach for peak performance, there are probably two books I would look at. Peak, The New Science of Athletic Performance, that's Revolutionizing Sport by Dr. Marc Bubbs, will cover you from that physical standpoint. And Peak Performance, which is by Brad Sturbrick and Steve Magnus, is one that will cover the mental side. The next book then is something that I have had on my bookshelf for probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And it was off the back of listening to an episode of the Tim Ferriss podcast where he was speaking about, I got a phone call, where he was the downside of an unedited podcast, where he was speaking about the book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And as somebody who doesn't play tennis, I kind of thought the title wasn't going to be applicable for me, but the more I seen it recommended on other podcasts, and it's such a short book, the audiobook's about 3 hours long, maybe 3.5 hours long, by Timothy Gallwey, I said, okay, I'm going to give it a go and see what happens. And I'm so glad that I did. Now, this book is very heavy on the mindset side of things. And if you've ever heard of the flow state or in the zone, is what a lot of athletes call it. It's when you're in that kind of timeless, you're not even thinking about what you're doing, you're just having the best game of your life and you're not really thinking about it. That's your flow state. There's a great book by Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, who was the originator and pioneer of the flow state. And I have an upcoming podcast actually coming with Stephen Kotler on my other podcast, who wrote The Rise of Superman, which is another book on flow state. It's a very good one. But Inner Game of Tennis talks about athletes entering into that flow state and not thinking about your game after a certain point. And he talks about system 1 and system 2 in and how athletes tend to show up in game day performances and on the pitch. System 1 is where you're thinking about everything you're doing. You're thinking about your pass. You're thinking about what you're going to do next. You're thinking about the shot that you scored or the shot that you missed. You're thinking about the block that you got or the one that you missed. System 2 is when you're in that zone state. You're in the flow state, and you're not thinking about it anymore. You're learning to disconnect from what's going on and trusting your body and trusting that you've done the work. If you're 15, 16, 17 listening to this podcast, it's probably not as applicable. But if you've been playing the game for 10 years and you've got more than your 10,000 hours in terms of your deliberate practice, you're going to find that you probably can be your own biggest enemy. You know how to kick a ball, you know how to hit a sliotar, you know how to block, you know how to tackle, you know where to move, you know where to run. But sometimes when it comes to game day scenario, you lose that. Or if you're a free kick taker or you take frees, that you're struggling to switch off the outside world when you're about to take a spot kick, whether it's a penalty kick or a free kick. And the inner game of tennis goes through this. I actually gave it and gifted it to one of my friends who struggles with frees. He's a great free taker, but in pressure moments, he's always struggled to just switch off everything around him. And I gave him this book and he said it really helped him. So the inner game of tennis, although the examples in there are tennis based, it can be applied to nearly any sport, but particularly to GAA. The next one then is The Life, Michael Jordon by Roland Lazenby. This is one of my favorite books of all time, and as somebody who's a huge Michael Jordan fan. Michael Jordan, in terms of being one of the greatest of all time, in my opinion, from his sport, and a huge fan of the Netflix documentary The Last Dance, something that I watch quite regularly. I'm a big fan of his approach in terms of what it takes to be the best. Now, whether you want to go to that extreme is a different story, but this book gives you a very well-rounded scenario or story of his life mixed in with how he approached things. So it's not him that wrote it. It's a outside person writing about Michael Jordan, which is generally my favorite way to consume these kind of books because they don't have all the narrative fallacies. They don't have all the biased stories. They tend to be, these are the facts. This is what's happened. And this is how the athlete tends to approach games, how he approaches training, how he approaches life. And the book is a mammoth. It's huge. It's 20 plus hours on audio. But when I was training for Marathon des Sables, which is 6 back-to-back marathons through the Sahara in 2018, on my training runs, this was a book I would listen to. And partly because it was so long, so it got me through so many runs, but also it focused and refocused my mindset towards, well, this is how you need to show up as an athlete to perform like this. And it was just a constant putting yourself into this zone of you need to do your workouts. It doesn't matter if you're sore. It doesn't matter if it's painful. Power through, keep going. And learning about somebody like Michael Jordan and how they live their life and how they approach things. And he was somebody that his teammates hated to a degree, and a lot of them disliked him, but they all respected him and they all respected his approach because he was very hard on people around him and very hard on himself. And one of the things that came up constantly through the book was, although they disliked him on a personal level, on a professional level, he never asked his teammates to do anything he wouldn't do. And it just came up time and time and time and time again. And it's something that, although you might not want to be a dick or a twat to everybody in your circle, like maybe Michael Jordan possibly was off the back of reading this and even watching The Last Dance, but taking out the best parts of his approach. And you see that success leaves clues with athletes. If you read about Cristiano Ronaldo in particular, I think they're probably the two closest in terms of their approach. I know you've got Lionel Messi in soccer as well, who's probably closer to genetically and naturally gifted. I think maybe Tom Brady in the NFL is in this bracket too. People who look after themselves. But Ronaldo and Michael Jordan are very similar in terms of their approach. I remember reading a story about Ronaldo after a Champions League game where all his teammates were going to bed when they got in from a flight at 4 a.m. and he went straight to his cryotherapy bath. He said, I need to recover before I go to sleep for tomorrow. And those small things and those marginal gains add up. And when you see it firsthand, or not firsthand, secondhand or third hand in this case, you're able to potentially take some of the best bits and apply it to your own game. The next one then is the Bible of flexibility and stretching. And that's Becoming a Supple Leopard by Dr. Kelly Starrett. I don't necessarily recommend reading this one in its entirety. It's a huge book. It's not on audio. You're going to need the physical book because there's so many pictures and diagrams in it. And I did read it from start to finish, but as somebody that is a sports nutritionist, strength and conditioning coach, it makes sense for me in terms of to arm myself with the skills. But if I wasn't working with other athletes, I probably would have kept this as a tool book. Now, it's an expensive book. It's about 40 or 50 quid to buy because it's a big book. It's like an encyclopedia, but it has everything you need in it in terms of keeping yourself loose, flexibility, stretching, and just, as the name suggests, becoming a supple leopard. So if you're somebody who struggles with the injury side of game or the recovery side of your game, and you're okay with nutrition, with the training and the sleep, and you want to take it to another level with your flexibility, stretching and suppleness, then this is the book that will do that. It will give you prescriptions. It'll give you programs in terms of how to stretch, when to do it, how to use your bands correctly to do it, and to stay on top of any potential injury that you would have. As I said, it's not one I would necessarily read or recommend reading from start to finish. It's a big, big book, but there's a lot of diagrams, a lot of pictures, and generally what I'll find is if I'm feeling exceptionally tight in a muscle group, I'll just flick into the book and go, right, what's the best glute stretch, or what's the best quad stretch for tightness through my hips, and then I'll go to that book, take out the stretch, and then I'll incorporate it into my program. So it's a useful tool. I think if you're a coach or a trainer, it's a very, very handy one to have. And then the fifth book, before I get into the honourable mention, is Mindset by Dewek. Now, I'm hesitantly recommending this one because there's parts of this book that are just not going to apply to you depending on your stage of life. This is similar to the book Peak, The New Science of Athletic Performance. This book tries to be a lot of things to a lot of people, and that is the best thing about it and the worst thing about it, meaning that I can recommend this book to someone who's struggling with parenting and getting a life balance, and I can also recommend it to a high-end athlete or somebody that I'm working with at an intra-county level because of the psychology that's required and that growth mindset versus a closed mindset when it comes to improvement in an area of your life. And what I would recommend with Mindset from Dewek is, if you are somebody who's at the stage of your life where you haven't read any books on mindset and you want to just get an overall grasp on the idea of how it applies to business and parenting and sports, then read the whole thing. Otherwise, I would skip straight to the sports section. When I read it first, and it was several years ago when I read it, 6 or 7 years ago at this point, maybe 5 years ago, it was quite a while ago when I read it the first time. I remember thinking, you know what, I just needed the sports section. This is what's applicable to me now. So you don't need to read this in its entirety, but it is a good book. She's the pioneer when it comes to that growth versus closed mindset and that entire approach to improvement as an athlete. And I think there's a lot of value in there for anybody that struggled with the mindset side of how you can improve. Now, I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're already in that bracket of a growth mindset, and this is just something that will double down and give you some of the research to show why you think the way you do. Then the honourable mention is Glute Lab by Bret Contreras. And for the same reason, I don't necessarily recommend becoming a supple leopard and reading it in its entirety. Glute Lab is the same kind of book. It's huge. It is an absolute mammoth of a book and an encyclopedia for glute training. Now, I've had Bret on my other podcast, the Brian Keane podcast. I think it was in January of this year. And Bret puts out great stuff on Instagram. Very much either for athletes in terms of how to glute train, or for bikini fitness girls who want to grow and build and hypertrophy and build muscle in their bum and in their glutes. But Glute Lab is similar to Kelly Starrett's book on becoming a supple leopard. When I'm looking for new glute exercises to incorporate into my program so that I can work on my speed and my power, I will go in, I'll pick out a couple of exercises from that book, and then I'll incorporate them into my program. You'll have seen a lot of them on my TikToks and Instagram. When I'm putting in glute exercises, I'm normally taking them from this book. I think Bret is the go-to guy. He's called the glute guy on Instagram. And as a sports scientist and somebody who's very heavy in the research, he knows exactly what needs to be done and how to periodize programs so that you're able to maximize strength and performance in your glute region. So as an honourable mention, I think it's a useful one. It's also not on Audible. So again, hence why it's in the outside of the top 5 books, but hopefully that helps. So there are 5 books that are must read, or at least considers books to consider if you're looking to improve as a GAA player. Now, I didn't and haven't mentioned any of mine for obvious reasons. I didn't want to be that twat who's like, read my books. And to be honest, with the exception of obviously GAA Leaner, Stronger, Faster, which is just a self-published book that I wrote for young players who are looking to improve their knowledge around food and training, etc. Rewire Your Mindset, my second book, if you struggle with the mindset side of the game, could be a useful one. But as I said, there are probably better books out there who can support you, or that can support you more depending on what you're struggling with. As I said, Peak, the New Science of Athletic Performance, gives you a nice little rounded view. That's a book that, if it was taken and rewritten for a GAA player, it would be probably the Bible, but there's a bit too much in it from different sports, so you have to go in with a kind of goal miner approach, where you're not trying to consume the whole book and take everything from it. You're looking for the bits and the golden nuggets that are applicable to you, and then taking that. Inner Game of Tennis, as I said, is one that I wish I read years ago, particularly in my early days, and particularly if you're someone who struggles with set pieces or the parts of the game where everything is slowing down and it's all on you. The Life by Michael Jordon, a personal favourite of mine, one that I reread every couple of years just because of the story and the narrative I love, and I'm a big fan of Michael Jordon. And then Becoming a Supple, Leopard and Mindset, and potentially Glute Lab by Bret, Contreras as well. So hopefully that helps. As I mentioned, I will put the free audiobook link in the description as well. So if you don't have an Audible account, that's what I use for audiobooks. There's several others, audiobooks.com. I think this iBooks have one as well. But Audible is the one I use. It's the one that's linked through Amazon. And I've set up a link with them that you can get an affiliate link that you can get your first audiobook for free with Audible. So click on that if it's something you want to check out. I will also, as always, although I didn't talk about them today, link my GAA Lean Body program and the GAA Graduate S&C program in the description below for anyone that wants details. That's all from me from this week's episode. Catch you all next week.